Hey, everybody, how's it going today? Glowplasma231 here, back in today to talk about Oshi chapter number 145. This chapter is titled Children. And let me say, for the record, just put it out there, I'm sorry if this video isn't too good. I have not filmed a proper video, or one of these where I actually talk about like a manga chapter and current events going on in the series, in like a month. So, I am bound to be really rusty here, and because of that, I am sorry. I will try my best, but we're just going to see how this happens. But to get into this chapter of Oshinoko itself, this is actually a very good chapter for me to come back on because it's a chapter that doesn't rely too much on many other scenes and previous experiences, right? This is almost a very self-contained chapter in the sort of big world of Oshinoko. I wouldn't call it a big world. I mean, this is still like a small series, and like it's not like the world building that One Piece had at like 150 chapters, right? Oshinoko is a bit different in that sense, but getting into like the chapter itself, this chapter is one that specifically focuses on Crow Girl and her being a child actor in this sense, and there's a little bit of a weird part to it later, but we'll get to that whenever we get to it. But yeah, this chapter is almost entirely focused on Crow Girl and how she has been going through and how she will end up acting in the 15-year line movie, right? But to just hop right on into it, we see we're on cut number 127 titled Whining Daughter, as we see that Crow Girl here is playing a very young Ruby in this scene, as she is just crying, and just like, no, I don't want to do it, right? And being very like a pouty little kid, as we see that, of course, our favorite character, I kept wanting to call her More Tomato, but that is wrong because More Tomato was a character in Mashle Magic and Muscles during like their Tri-Wizard Tournament exam thing. That's one of the characters there. No, this character is named Tomato Jam, which is still a great name for a character. It's just still like a very punny name pretty much. But of course, Tomato Jam here is playing the role of Miyako in the movie. So, as we see here that Crow Girl is just crying, and she's just like, no, I don't want to dance, right? Playing that role of Ruby in a scene that we have said before, we see that Miyako is just like, hey, why are you saying that? And Ruby's just like, no, because I don't want to do it. And she just starts crying for her mom, who of course is Ai, who is not in the scene at this point. And she's just like crying, like, mama, right? And eventually some of the producers are just like, all right, cut scene there, good and done, we got it. And as that happens, we see that Crow Girl finally just like snaps out of it, right? Gets out of the roll and is just standing there. We even see that like she has like a very blank stare almost. Like it's a very interesting look that she has going on here. And Ruby has been standing in the background watching Crow Girl do this portrayal over this entire time. And eventually, Ruby's is like, wow, I really like that as a child? And Crow Girl is just like, yeah, you sure were. And then Ruby's just like, no, wait, how do I put it? Like, back then I was like way more mature than other kids around me. And she's like, hey, I was definitely a child prodigy for sure. As Crow Girl's just like, is that really how you see yourself? Like, that's a very narrow-minded and self-centered view, and like she's like, what's going on here, right? It is pretty fun to see like Ruby just being taken down by this, by seeing her past self being acted out. It is a very funny scene to me. I do really enjoy it. And as she just continues to say this, Crow Girl just says like, hey, you were so childish back then that I really wondered if you were truly even reborn, because of course she's the one who's been sort of said to reborn these two kids, give them a new life. And she just says that, she's like, and you made a fuss about every stupid thing. It was so annoying to witness, right? And Ruby's just like, hey, don't say it like you actually were there and saw me do this myself. I mean, you weren't even alive back then, right? I mean, how could you have been? As Crow Girl gives a little laugh to this, like a little tee-hee, and that's sort of where she ends her segment there for the time. As Ruby eventually just says like, hey, but how boring. She's like, hey, I thought you'd act super as Crow Girl sort of just does that little laugh there, Ruby eventually just cuts on to a different topic, just saying like, oh man, how boring. She's like, hey Crow Girl, I thought you'd act so badly that you'd be super embarrassed and it'd be really fun sort of to get back at you there, right? And Crow Girl's just like, hey, like, I'm sorry for not meeting your expectations, sort of in that very snarky way. And eventually, they eventually get onto the next topic of like, hey, anyway, we gotta film the dance scene next, and I, feel strongly attached to it, so you better do it properly. And Crow Girl to this is like, hey, like, I know all that, just hurry and go and change your clothes so we can go and get this scene filmed, right? As we then go on to cut 30, which is the mother and daughter's dance practice. Again, this is another scene that we have seen in the first volume of the manga before, well, I got murdered. So we have seen this scene before, and this was one of those really big scenes that we all remember of where Ruby was trying to dance, but she couldn't really do it. So I eventually came up and showed her the ropes and gave her the push that she needed to fully be a good dancer. And we sort of see that same scene here, as we see that Crow Girl and all of the dress of Ruby there, and that sort of like jacket and hair all tied up, is sort of just standing there. And eventually one of the producers just yells like, all right, scene start. And eventually, she eventually just starts dancing, and she does all of these things, right? And eventually, she goes around and she just falls down flat on her face. But of course, who would be there next but Ruby's hand to try to pick her up, as we don't clearly see Ruby here. We just see her hand extending down to a crying Crow Girl on the ground, who of course just fell down in this dancing. So very nice acting and all of that sort of deal. We sort of get a little bit of into Crow Girl's mind here. She just has like a little bit of a thought of like, oh, is she really a child, huh? She doesn't have the sliding feelings of awe. Shall I give her some punishment? And those are just the little words that we hear there. As on the next page, we cut over to scene 136, the awfully smart son. As we see that Crow Girl has now gone on from playing Ruby in the movie to now she's also playing Aqua in the movie, right? So it's a little weird that she's playing both roles, but I mean, I guess it is one more child actor that they have to hire, so I guess Crow Girl's good at playing both of them. But we pretty much see Aqua here, and Aqua's in his like school dress or whatever in a very fancy clothing, and he's holding a little book out there, and eventually he gets into his acting as he's just like, or she is just like, I'm sorry, we see that Crow Girl is doing her acting as Aqua, just going like, hey, we're just kids, but we won't interfere on set. If one of us makes a mistake, please tell me right away. Like, I look forward to your continued patronage with our eye, right? And as all of this is going on, Gotonda is really cracking up at this, as he's just laughing. He's like, all right, you guys can cut there. As we even see that Gotonda's like, oh man, Crow Girl, like, you are so like Aqua was back in the day. Because of course he had first-hand experience with this, because I mean, he was there whenever this whole acting thing happened. So eventually, Crow Girl again looks back, and this time Ruby is standing there, but also Kana is standing beside her. This is very reminiscent to that scene earlier. I mean, it's almost the same exact scene, right? As eventually Ruby's just, of course, Kana's there. Ruby's like, all right, so what do you think, senpai? As Kana's just looking over at Tsukuyomi dressed as Aqua. It's like, what's going on here, right? And she eventually just like starts to get very deep into this, and she's just like, all right, well, how do I put it? She calls Aqua Akun, which I don't think that we've seen her call Aqua that before. Maybe, I mean, there are like 140 other chapters, 144 other chapters that she could have, but I don't think I ever remember her calling Aqua Akun. I mean, whenever I hear the name Akun, I always think of the one redheaded kid, a friend of Takamichi's in Tokyo Revengers, just because, I mean, that's the one character I can really remember being called Akun. But yeah, to get back into it, I don't remember Kana specifically ever calling anybody Akun before, but whatever. She eventually just continues to saying, like, hey, Aqua's acting style was much more mysterious and cute at the same time, and she just continues saying, like, hey, while Tsukuyomi's not bad, she acts a little childish, right? She's like, hey, back then, Aqua was so cute, I thought he was an angel, but her direction of cuteness she's going in is just not quite the right one. And of course, Tsukuyomi or Crow Girl here is just like, oh man, now I've got two annoying observers looking at my every move now, right? Kana continues to say, like, hey, anyway, it seems that you can act more, or that you can act more or less, like, you can do it pretty well. And she's just like, hey, but you were nothing compared to how I was as a child actor. Like, I was almost a prodigy in their eyes, right? And she's like, hey, Tsukuyomi, don't get carried away just because you were just super, super cute, right? As Ruby's just like, hey, there's no need to compete here, right? I mean, you're much older than she is. Like no need to do any of this. No need to worry or any of that sort of thing, right? As Ruby eventually goes over and crouches in front of Tsukuyomi, who of course is still dressed as Aqua, and she's like, but hey, I think she matches his image quite well. And she is like, hey, back then I only thought of my brother as like a really small and creepy kid, so I didn't really have many opportunities to see him properly. But she's like, but maybe I should take a look at him a little more closely. As eventually she's just like, hey, this is something I really missed out on back then. She picks up Tsukuyomi, of course, dressed as Aqua, and just starts like snuggling against her face, like just rubbing cheeks and all of that, right? And she eventually just says like, hey, let me enjoy him like this while I can. And Kana's just like, oh man, can I do it too? Right? And all in all, Tsukuyomi's like, hey, stop that. That's just really stupid and disgusting. Like, why do you want to touch me, the famous crow girl? Like, this is a little weird. Till eventually all of this happens. And we end up seeing that, like, she's blushing a little bit because she sort of enjoys this a little bit of attention, right? As eventually Aqua fully walks in the room. And Ruby turns around and is like, oh, hey there, Aqua, what's going on, right? And Ruby makes a little bit of a joke, just saying like, oh man, the real thing is the best after all, right? And we see that Kana has a very disgusted face here, of course, because the whole, oh yeah, their brother and sister thing that the series cannot just beat allegations on, because golly, who says Akasaki can write a normal manga? Right? And we also see that in the background, Tsukuyomi is fully looking at Aqua like, huh? But eventually we see that Aqua walks over to Kroguro or Tsukuyomi, and she's like, hey Tsukuyomi, I was watching you act on a monitor, and she just says like, hey, was I able to fully meet your expectations? And to this, Aqua just says like, hey, I wasn't that childish, I was more like a little child prodigy, right? As of course Kroguro's just like, oh man, so you were really annoying too, right? Which is pretty funny that both siblings definitely saw themselves as like child prodigy actors, and like they're both full of themselves, as I sort of said there a second ago. So it is definitely very interesting and funny to see sort of Aqua have the same exact reaction that Kana just had, right? The next scene we sort of just see the three of them talking, Aqua, Kana, and Ruby. And in the background, we see Kroguro taking the Aqua wig off that she was wearing and sort of getting her normal hair back after taking the wig off, right? And eventually, we just see that Kroguro sort of mutters under herself in her breath, just like, oh man, you guys were always like that. Or at least from my perspective. As we suddenly fade to black as we go to a sort of a little bit of a flashback scene, where we see this is at the hospital where, of course, Goro and Serena were, of course, the predecessors to Aqua and Ruby. And we see that this is one of the times when Serena was led outside. And as she was outside walking around, she's like, oh, hey, what's that? What's wrong? Did you get hurt? And we see that she's looking down on a crow that's trapped in a net on the ground. The crow is just like squawking and like call, squeak, squeak, like all of that stuff, like being a crow. And we see all of its black feathers sort of rustling around on the ground and falling out, right? At this point, we see Goro run up to Serena. It's like, oh, hey, Serena-chan. Hey, wild birds carry germs, so don't touch it, all right? But Serena's just like, hey, I don't need to worry about that. But this is obviously hurt, so she's just like, hey, let me pick it up. And she picks up this crow, and she's like, hey, stop struggling and everything, right? As we eventually see that she gets the net off of it and, like, starts to hold it by its wings, the correct and proper way to hold a bird. As Serena's just like, hey, Goro, can you, like, heal her? And she's like, hey, you are a doctor, right? As Goro sort of just looks down at Serena and is like, hey, I would love to help her, but I'm not a vet. Like, this isn't my main job. Like, I'm here to help you. I'm not here to help all of these other birds. And it's a very nice moment as we then cut up to the sun in the sky. As eventually we see that Serena looks over and sees all of the berry bushes on the property of the hospital and all of the nets cut around it. As eventually Serena's just like, oh man, I mean, I guess this net must have caught this bird whenever she tried to go and eat all those berries, right? And she's like, man, this bird is both very gluttonous and clumsy at the same time, right? And Goro is just like, hey, I mean, some people even say that some birds become blind at night, which I don't know if that's like a real thing. I actually want to look that up now. Like, do birds become blind, blind, at night? Because I've actually never heard of that. That's just a little bit of a weird thing. However, certain birds have better night versions than other. The birds have night vision sometimes. Can birds see at night? It seems, yeah, I don't know. I need to do a bit more research into it instead of just reading like the little blurbs at the front page of Google. But Goro says this, and Serena's just like, oh boy, you seem to know a lot about this, huh? Like, that's pretty cool, right? As eventually we see that the leg of the bird's a little hurt, and we eventually see that Goro has just taken some medical stuff and sort of put a little stent around the bird leg, patching it up to sort of help the bird out, right? As Goro's just like, hey, this should do it. As he eventually lets the bird out of his grasp, this crow, and it just starts flying around, and Serena's just like, hey, pay more attention to your surroundings next time, alright, Mr. Bird? Just like, hey, don't be greedy. As the crow flies away, and eventually we suddenly cut over to a bunch of different scenes where we see Goro and Serena in the hospital, Serena riding a little bit of a bike, and Goro walking behind her in plain clothes. And eventually we even see that the crow is standing and watching Serena through the window. We even see like one of those little snowmen that Serena made. The hat had fallen off of it, and the crow bends down, picks up the hat, and puts it back on the snowman where Serena originally put it, right? And then we eventually see the final scene where Serena died, sadly, and Goro's crying over her corpse in the bed. And we see the bird is looking at this, and we just see as the bird starts calling, almost crying in its own way. And eventually we fade back to the present, where Tsukuyomi has obviously been thinking about all of this, being all of her crow girl ideas, right? And we eventually cut to more of a conversation that Ruby, Kana, and Aqua are having before. As Ruby is just like, hey, Kana's like a senior actor, how many points would you give her, right? As Kana's like, hey, I'd give her about probably, I don't know, like 60 points, like that's 3/5 out of 100, like, I mean, but the only problem is, like, her acting is just way too cute, right? And she's like, and she makes, Aqua look like a total child, calling him Akun again. And, she's just like, hey, but Akun was more, and Aqua sort of cuts her off. She's like, hey, I was more intelligent, right? And eventually we see that, Crow Girl just thinks, like, hey, well, it's maybe true that I acted a little cuter than they were in the real person, but I can't help it. As we see that she eventually mutters beneath her breath, to me, you guys have always been cheeky and cute children after all. And that's where we end off this chapter. Like I said, this chapter doesn't really have any bounds on the story itself. There's no big thing of like, oh man, Aqua and Ruby have emotional development in this chapter, or we see Kana do acting, or Kane do acting, or any of our characters doing acting. It's a small, nice, contained story telling the story of a little bit why these two got reincarnated, right? What Crow Girl, or Tsukuyomi, as I started calling her halfway through this episode, what she has to do with anything. And it's a very nice and small and self-contained moment in this one chapter of the series. Online, I remember seeing that a lot of people didn't really like this chapter because it's not that high-octane stuff. There's no lore to it. There's no really big, interesting deal going on. But this is just a really, really nice chapter. Sort of just seeing the whole jokes about how how Ruby and Aqua are full of themselves a little bit. And I really like the moment of going tone to laughing halfway through. Just like, oh man, you are so like how Aqua was back in the day, Tsukuyomi. It's just really, really nice to see. Until that eventual moment of just like, hey, this is why these two are reincarnated. Their kindness to this one crow on this one time where they could have easily just walked by it. It just gives a different level to why these two characters are here and reincarnated, and of course Aqua and Ruby now. And just seeing how Tsukuyomi's involvement was in that. It's just very cute and very nice to see. And even just that little flashback to 2 pages where we sort of get the idea that this crow has been helping these two out for the longest time, looking at Serena, taking in all of the moments between the two of them, and eventually sort of what is it, calling and like almost crying on Serena's death. It's very, very sad to see, but it really lends to a lot. So I definitely think this is a great chapter, even if a lot of people don't think it is. Just the final moment of just like, hey, to me, you guys have always been cheeky and cute children after all. Just a great little moment in the chapter, and definitely a really good moment. And I can definitely say that Crow Girl hasn't been one of my favorite characters throughout the series, but this is a very heartwarming moment, and definitely a way that I can see, oh yeah, I understand who these characters are, and I understand why she would go through and reincarnate these two. Very cute chapter, but with that, I really don't have too much else to say about this chapter. Like I said, great, small, emotional, bite-sized chapter. I don't think you can go wrong with it at all. But yeah, with that, I mean, thank you guys so very much for watching. Like I said, I haven't recorded one of these Oshinoko chapter reviews in so very long, so thank you guys for watching. And I know I've been very inconsistent, but I'm going to try to stay consistent again. I know I say it every time, but now that my schooling's over for the year, I've got so much more free time, so yeah, that's just great and awesome. So if you did enjoy this, hope you won't mind helping me out, do all the little things that we YouTubers ask you to do. Comment down below how you thought about this chapter, subscribe to the channel, and leave a like. All of those things just really, really help me out. And hey, even if you didn't like this video, give it a dislike. I mean, I prefer you don't, but let me know your actual full thoughts. And yeah, with that, I really don't have too much else to say. Another great chapter of Oshinoko, of course, being titled chapter number 155, titled Children. And yeah, thank you guys so very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. This will be Glowplasma231, signing out.